My turtle deck stringers are a little bit different than most, I think. What most people decide to do is they'll make their stringers really tall. And what that will do is it prevents the fabric, when the fabric is shrunk, it prevents the fabric from pushing these stringers down this way. But usually when they're tall, they're very thin and they'll tend to flex side to side. And what a lot of people will do then is put supports between them to keep them from moving side to side because they're so thin. What I elected to do was to make mine a little bit more beefy. These are about 1 inch tall and a 1/2 inch wide. So they're beefy enough that they won't collapse inward or downward when the fabric is put on. And they're also beefy enough that they won't move side to side when the fabric is put on. Now, the only problem with that was if I would have made these pieces square, whereas they would have been 1 inch tall and a 1/2 inch wide, when the fabric was put into place, you would see that 1/2 inch flat on each one of these for the entire length of these stringers. The fabric would be on and there'd be a flat, a flat, a flat. And I thought that would look really ugly. So what I did was, using a router table, I went ahead and I routed this top edge so that it kind of comes to a point. It's a soft point. You probably can't even see it. It's a soft point. It's not a very sharp edge, but they're kind of bullet shaped. They're curved toward the top here. And I have some still pictures that I'll include. But what that will do then, when the fabric is put on and shrunk, the only thing you should see is that little fine line right down the center of each one of these. So I've got the beefiness for the strength, but they're not incredibly huge either. So there's not a lot of weight here, but they're strong. And then with this little rounded over tip, so to speak, should give a little fine line when the fabric is put on. So we'll see. Obviously, when I get to that point and I do the video for the fabric, we'll all know. And then I decided to put this cover on. I had seen this done different ways with different looks. This is just the way I decided to do it with these scallops all the way around it, obviously. This is the top. And what I had done, if you look here, this is a 1/4 inch piece of plywood here on the back side of this plywood for the seat back. And it does two things for me. It gives me this edge here for this plate to go on. And it also, on the back side, it comes up to about here and stops. And it's that lip that this piece sits on. And that's all epoxied in place all the way around. And then of course this outer cover is also epoxy to each individual stringer along the top here on all of these. So it's pretty solid. It's just a 1/16 inch piece of plywood, but it's very solid and easy to bend, and it gives me the look that I wanted. And then another possible difference, I don't know for sure because I have not been exposed to very many Pietenpols, but the ones that I have seen quite often, this back part here will be slightly domed. I've seen them, you know, they're pretty abrupt, and then I've seen others that are just ever so slightly domed. And here's my logic of thinking. The horizontal stabilizer mounts here, and of course for the most part the horizontal stabilizer is flat. And it didn't make sense to me to have this flat piece come up here and stop and butt up against something that's domed. So what I elected to do was to keep mine flat. So this dimension here, this height is the same height as the horizontal stabilizer. So the horizontal stabilizer will come across flat, and this comes across flat. And then from here, as it goes up to the front of the turtle deck up there, it transitions from this flat to the dome, to the curve. So this begins flat right here, as you can very well see. And then as it comes across, it starts that transition into the dome. And as it transitions to the dome, it also goes from this skinny dimension up to this fat dimension across here. So you get a widening of the turtle deck, and you get the dome part as well. And I thought it turned out pretty nice. This is just another decorative piece, as I did up on the front there. And it also adds some strength. I had, maybe I should come to it from this side. Or maybe I think I've already talked about the addition of this piece for the horizontal. Let me check that. I think I've already talked about this additional piece. Anyway, it doesn't have anything to do with the turtle deck, so that's what I think about that. I put this piece of plywood here. This is actually the piece I want to talk about. This piece runs across here. This one. This piece runs across the longerons here. And this is the piece that all of the individual stringers rest on underneath here. So these get epoxied to this. They also get epoxy to this piece, and then of course they get tied together with this top piece. So just as I did in the front, pretty much all the stringers are locked in and tied in place here and on the end, the other end. And then along the way they're supported with these stringer bulkheads. And these bulkheads are epoxied to the cross braces that were put in when the fuselage sides were being assembled. So this just gets epoxied right to the face here of this cross member. And they're both the same way. You can't see this one as easily because of my shelf, but it's the same way. It's epoxied to this cross piece here. And then of course my shelf, I ran all the way back to this first bulkhead. It's a good sized storage space. You can't put a lot of weight back here because it's behind the CG, but there's plenty of room. So that's my turtle deck.
As with most odd-shaped items on the airplane, I first start out with making templates. These are the templates that I made for the turtle deck stringer bulkheads. Now, these were pretty tedious to make. I spent quite a bit of time on these because, first of all, I had to decide how many stringers I wanted to use, and I think that's pretty much a matter of preference. People use different amounts, different numbers of stringers. And I also had to decide how I wanted, how much of a curve I wanted, how much of a dome shape I wanted for each one, and they're both different. Obviously because they're different widths and they need to be different heights, and since my stringers, as you work your way from forward to back, they flatten out. So one is not quite as curved as the other because they start to flatten as you work your way back. So this took some work. It took a lot of trial and error and tweaking, and I would put them in place with some tape and run a couple of rough cut stringers through them just to see if I was getting the angles and the orientation right. This picture's got the horizontal temporarily in place because the stringers, as you saw, they dead end into the leading edge of the horizontal, and I wanted them to lay flat along the leading edge of the horizontal. So I had it in place, and I was running my stringers to it temporarily and then tweaking the templates so that the boards would lay down in those finger grooves nice, and I would get the appropriate angles and the details needed to get the shape that I wanted. Here's a great example of the hint that you had just read. To the top left there is my storage shelf that's behind the passenger seat, and then the first bulkhead for the turtle deck stringers that's being held in place with the little black clamps. And then there's a diagonal top brace that goes between the two sides of the fuselage. Now, if you can imagine that bulkhead not being in place, if I would have incorporated this top gusset into my shelf, which I almost did. When I made my shelf, I almost made this gusset part of the shelf rather than having it a separate piece. Had I had done that, then this bulkhead could not fit the way that you see it fitted here. It rests a little bit on top of the diagonal, and it rests a little bit on top of the fuselage longeron. If I would have incorporated this gusset for that diagonal into my storage shelf, then this bulkhead could not come over as far as it does. So luckily I caught that, and I made my shelf and glued it in place. Then I made my templates and the actual pieces for the stringer bulkheads. And after I got them in place, I was able to go back and make the individual gussets for the different cross members and diagonals that hold the top of the fuselage together. So, long-winded explanation for the hint, but hopefully this will make it a little bit more clear for you. Here is the first or forwardmost bulkhead for the turtle deck stringers. Now this one here is just temporarily clamped in place. It's not epoxied yet. As a matter of fact, I don't think I epoxied these in until I had the stringers all formed and shaped and cut and fitted, and was pretty much finished making the entire turtle deck. And I think it was at that point then I went back and epoxied these permanently in place. So I waited until the very last minute that I could to actually epoxy them. But anyway, obviously these are made from the templates, traced out and cut, and even at this point I still had to fool with the finger grooves where the boards actually fit, just to get everything to fit properly and to curve really nice. And then here is the second bulkhead, or the bulkhead closest to the tail. You can see it's a different shape, it's not curved as much. But again, clamped in temporarily, and just keep working at it and fitting it and fooling with it until you get it shaped right. One thing to note are the fingers that stick up, the parts of the bulkhead that go between the stringers. You don't want them very long. You want them obviously to be down below the tops of the stringers themselves, so that they won't interfere with the fabric when you put the fabric on. There's a few things in this picture. Some are turtle deck related. One, anyway, is not, but I'll get to that in a second. The actual stringers that you see here, they have not been shaped. In other words, they're still flat on the top. I haven't routed that bullet shape on the front edge or the top edge of these yet. These are just the flat boards temporarily in place being fitted. On the aft end of the stringers, I have my flat piece of wood C-clamped in place for the stringers to butt up against. This is that flat transition piece between the end of the stringers and the leading edge of the horizontal stabilizer. And then at the very tail of the plane, you can ignore all that mess. I'm just clamping in my side gussets for the tail post. So again, this is just a dry fit picture. Nothing has been shaped. I'm just cutting the stringers to length, and I'm trying to get them to curve nicely toward the back, and I'm trying to get the spacing even between each stringer by adjusting the width of the fingers on the bulkheads. Here's a little bit of a better angle on the stringers. Again, these are just being laid in roughly just to get everything fitted. You can see that the turtle deck stringer bulkheads are still just clamped in place. Nothing's being epoxied permanently. The transition block, so to speak, on the aft end is C-clamped. That's the block of wood that the turtle deck stringer's dead end into. And again, these are in the rough, so to speak. They have not been shaped along the top edge. They're still flat around the top. And again, I'm just literally chipping away at the bulkhead finger slots, just trying to get these stringers to nestle in where I need them to, and to get the spacing between them so that they're spaced evenly from one to the other. Here I am, hard at work, finally milling the tops of these stringers. Now you can tell that I'm working hard, because if you look really close, you can see the bead of sweat on my forehead. Oh no, wait, that's just a shiny spot from my slick skin. Anyway, this is the simple little router table I use to route the edges, the top edges of the stringers, to give them that bullet shape. I don't own this router table. I don't know a whole lot about routing, so I really can't tell you what bit I used or what size it was or anything like that. It's just something that my father-in-law had given me, and I used it. So my apologies there, but you can use any kind of half round or quarter round bit and get the top edges to that bullet shape that you see here coming up, and that will give you a nice crisp line underneath the fabric rather than that fat, ugly flat. And after routing, this is what I ended up with. This is the cross-sectional view of a finished stringer. Again, I'm not exactly sure what the exact dimensions are of the stringers. Quite frankly, I'm too lazy to take my headset off, go upstairs and measure it, but I believe they're about 1 inch, 1 1/4 inch tall, and about a 1/2 inch wide. And then after you mill the length of these on both sides, you get this nice rounded bullet shape, and you can see that the very tip of this is where the fabric will lay, and again, that should give you a nice crisp line underneath the fabric, in theory. We'll see when I get to that point. So when it came time to start epoxying my stringers in place, this is how I did it. First thing that I did was I used a scrap piece of 16th inch plywood, a long strip of 16th inch plywood, and I curved it around the lip that I had talked about earlier that I had made on the back side of the pilot seat for the stringers. I curved it around that lip, and then I held it in place with these couple of large C-clamps. You can see the large C-clamp on the right. That is doing nothing more than holding that strip of 16th inch plywood so it will curve around the top of the back of the pilot seat. What that does is I bring the stringers up to the bottom of that piece of plywood, and it just keeps the top of the stringers even with the top of the curve that goes around the back of the seat. And then the little black clamps, I move them into position, and I move them around the stringers, up against the stringers, to hold the stringers in place. When you after you get done routing these and cutting the stringers to size, they tend to move around a little bit and warp and stuff. So I use the black clamps just to hold the stringers exactly where I want them in relation to each other. This picture is from the front view, looking back. Again, the large C-clamps are just holding the strip of plywood in place that's curved around the top. And then the smaller C-clamps, I move them around, like I said, to hold the stringers in place. If I need to move a stringer to the left or to the right, I just slide the little black clamps up against it and move it over and clamp it, and the clamps will hold it there for me. So I can lay everything out and look at it, make sure it's right, and then I can start to epoxy it. And as usual, when I have to make patterns for odd-shaped items, I go right to my poster board, which is what you see here. Now again, this reinforcement decorative area of the stringers. Some people do it, some people don't. Obviously you can make it any size shape that you want. This is the shape that I came up with, and again the curves were made using the that string method that I use for everything else that's curved. And again, I just laid it out on the poster board and kept fooling with it and kept cutting it and trimming it and fitting it until I got it to curve around the stringers the way that I wanted it, and I got the individual curves on the poster board to line up with the stringers the way that I wanted. And I made both. I made the templates for this piece and the smaller piece in the back that's just in front of the horizontal stabilizer. Here are both templates finished. Exciting, isn't it? I don't even know what else to say about them. And then obviously you trace those out on your plywood and get the plywood cut. And again, I would highly recommend using the utility knife because it leaves a nice clean cut, and it's easier to cut these curves with, I think, than trying to cut them with a bandsaw or some other saw. You get everything cut, and you can go ahead and glue the plywood in place. Now, this picture is a little deceiving in that I always harp on, according to the T88 packaging, you're supposed to use minimal clamping force, and this does not look minimal by any stretch of the imagination. But since it is curved, you do need clamps, or at least I did, to get it to hold down tight against the stringers. So even though there are a lot of clamps here, and some of them are C clamps and some of them are large C clamps, there's really not a lot of clamping force. I just have them tight enough to curve the plywood and to hold it up against the individual stringers, but nothing is really being crimped or smashed. So like I said, you do what you can, you do what you want to do. You can cut it any size shape you want and get it fitted in place, and hopefully it will look nice.
Hey everybody, just wanted to say real quick again, thanks for checking out my YouTube videos, and just a couple of real quick tidbits before you leave. If you'd be so kind as to check out my GoFundMe page, the link is down in the description of these videos. For those of you who find it in your heart to donate for this new cause of mine, I've got another project going on, and there's some really cool things I'd like to do with this aircraft, and again, that's all explained in my GoFundMe. But if you find moved enough to go do that and donate, I've got this horizontal stabilizer skin, and donors will get their name put on this skin, and ultimately when this gets filled and the aircraft gets finished, this is going to be hung up on the wall of honor in my hangar. Just a little bit of recognition for those donors who helped make the project a reality. Another thing too is, I'm sure you've noticed that even this video that I'm making right now is of the same or worse quality than the video that you just watched, and that's because, believe it or not, this camera is the exact same camera that I filmed the original hint videos with. So I just wanted to point that out. I'm not really sure why, but I know the video quality lacks, but hopefully the information within is worth something. And the other thing that I want to mention real quick is, again, these are little snippets from my hint video DVDs, so a lot of these individual clips just kind of come to an abrupt end. That's just the way it is when I'm trying to rip these DVDs apart and re-edit them into small little segments, and they just kind of end weird at times. But that's it. That's all I wanted to say. And again, thanks, and I hope you'll come back, check out my channel, and see if there are any new videos and updates. All right, I'll talk to you then. See you.